Let's revisit our top story now. A major review led by the former Labour Minister, Lord Hutton, in which he says fundamental changes to public sector pensions are essential if they are to remain affordable. Well, John Hutton joins us live from Westminster, as you see. Lord Hutton, a very good morning to you.
Morning, Colin.
Just looking at the preamble to your interim report, it's worth making the point, isn't it? This is very much just an interim report at this stage. But you talk about the fact that 40% of our adult life is likely for most of us, on average, to be spent in retirement. It's an amazing figure.
Well, it's an amazing figure, and of course for all of us who are approaching retirement, it's a pretty good figure. But of course, for all of us who have to then think about how we sustain the finances of public service pensions in particular, it raises an enormous challenge because the costs are rising substantially. They've risen by a third just in the last 10 years. So we really do have now to ask ourselves some pretty fundamental questions about how we provide for ourselves in retirement in the public service. But I'm not interested, Colin, in a race to the bottom. I'm not interested in reducing what are actually quite modest pensions for most people who retire from the public service. I'm not interested in reducing them to levels where people have to come back to the welfare state and ask for help through pension credits. I just don't think that's a very sensible reform. So what I'm interested in doing is trying to find a better way of putting these pensions, which are very important for our economy, onto a better balance, but not losing sight of the fact that first and foremost pensions are there to provide a decent retirement income for the folk who've worked in the public service and done such good work all their lives.
We mentioned one potentially shocking statistic. Here's another, that the average employer contribution in public sector pensions, the average contribution is 18%. 18%. Now, just from my own knowledge of how things work at B-Sky-B, our figures here in the private sector closer to 8%. Now, we hear all this talk, don't we, of fairness if we are to deal with the age of austerity. And people look at that disparity, they look at that gap and they say, it ain't fair.
Well, if you look at defined benefit pensions in the public sector and the private sector, I mean, broadly they provide a similar range of benefits. I think there is undoubtedly an issue about affordability and sustainability that I've got to address. And I think one of the interesting things about pension contributions is that if you go back in a number of years, the amount that employees were putting in and the amount that employers were putting in were roughly the same. And now that they're completely apart. And I think one of the things I am saying today is that because we've underestimated the cost of meeting these pension promises that we're making, there is a case for increasing pension contributions from employees, because at the moment the extra cost that is in the system because of rising longevity is being met largely, or in fact almost exclusively, by all of us as taxpayers. And I don't think that is the right balance that we should be striking. So my report is looking at the short term, saying things aren't right now, we need to correct them. But for the longer term, I'm ruling out this race to the bottom, because I really don't think that is a sensible thing for us to contemplate, because there are hidden costs as well in doing that. But I don't think the final salary system that we have across the public sector really now passes any credible test of being reasonable and fair. And it does need us to look again at that, and we should look at some radical options for reform.
I was talking to somebody recently who was related to somebody who had a senior position in our Foreign Office. I was astonished at how little they earned. I was told that one of the reasons they accepted such a relatively low salary, certainly compared to what somebody of that calibre could have earned in the private sector, was that they felt they were getting a good deal on their pension. And that's the flip side of this whole argument, isn't it? A lot of people who come into the public sector do so for a range of reasons, philanthropy among them, but also a sense that, well, you know, there's a good pension at the end of it.
No, I think that's been part of the story, and I don't dispute that, although what my report also tries to do today, Colin, is to say, well, actually, if you look at pay in the private sector and pay in the public sector, actually there isn't this difference anymore. I mean, it's not a thing you can generalize about, and I think there's a danger of generalizing, but generally, having said that you shouldn't generalize, generally the differences really aren't there anymore across the board. I think it's a great mistake to say, in simple terms, that the pensions can be this generous in the public service simply because pay is lower than the private sector. That's really not really largely true anymore. I think the gap between the public and the private sector when it comes to pension provision really is a concern, and it's a concern about, for me, about labour market mobility and productivity in the economy. There really mustn't be an iron curtain between the public and the private sectors fixed by pension entitlement. I think we need to encourage people to move across that line without concern about those issues. So I think the really is a real argument there about, again, looking at the structure of public service pensions. But I just really do want to make the point that I'm not interested, and my report is not based on the assumption that the only way to solve this problem is to sort of embark on this spiral downwards, because that is going to cause problems for us as taxpayers, because we'd have to make up the shortfall through the welfare system. And I just really don't think that's a sensible economy. That's a totally false economy to make.
Yeah, you know, even as we're talking, I'm looking at a news wire from the Agence France-Presse news agency saying that the French President Nicolas Sarkozy has said today he will inject 3.4 billion euros into his retirement reform bill. It's exactly the same thing we're talking about here. So some parents can retire earlier. And it goes on to say, as he faces open-ended strike action against the plan, there is a huge, some would say, vested interest potentially involved here. You may stir up some degree of militancy, which could end up in strike action. What's your message to those who are looking at reforms and saying, you know, we already are fearing for our jobs, now we're fearing for our pensions, it's time to strike?
Well, I'm not making decisions. I'm going to make recommendations in the spring about what I think is a fairer set of principles around which we can construct decent, adequate pensions for public service workers. So I want to build a consensus. I'm trying to lay the facts out as objectively as I can. I do believe very strongly that we can't go on as we are, that the burden of who pays for what, the sharing of risks and costs, is unfair to the taxpayer. But I think there is a way of addressing that without pushing all the decent folk, and I bow to no one in my respect for the public sector workforce, pushing all those decent folk into poverty and retirement. I'm not interested in that. But I do say to everyone, we've really got to look at this as objectively as possible. We've got to think about the national interest, and you use that expression and I agree with it. This is something that's vital to the savings infrastructure of the United Kingdom. Let's try and make the changes that I think are necessary, but without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The great thing about public service pensions is that about 85% of the workforce are contributing something towards their retirement. In the private sector, I'm afraid that figure is only now about a third. So I don't want to do anything that's going to put at risk the fact that so many people in the public service are actually doing the right thing and making a contribution to their pension. So we've, yes, got to tread carefully, but we really don't do ourselves any favours if we pretend that we can simply carry on as we are, because we can't.
It's a really delicate balancing act, isn't it? Lord Hutton, thank you very much indeed for explaining that to us.
Thank you.